Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We are going to get started. Okay. So over here we have a session on optimizing your capacity and cost. So the first thing I wanted to do is ask you guys, how many of you out there actually have a practice around managing your resources and the costs associated with those resources? How many? Okay, good, good. Well, I'm glad to see that. I think it's an area that companies are really starting to invest in more and more. At least that's what we're seeing as we go out and visit customers. And, for a long time, organizations kind of just bought resources and took it for granted that they were using them properly. Nowadays, it seems like it's becoming a bigger issue, especially with cloud, to make sure that you understand exactly what you have and how you're using it. And so today, we are very fortunate to have with us a guest, Jason Venti from Paychex, who is going to share with us how Paychex has actually implemented a very interesting practice for managing and planning, most importantly, what's going on with their resources and cost. But before we get into that, I just wanted to remind you maybe. Can somebody help me? Okay. So while he fixes that, we tested it. It worked just a minute ago. Okay, well, while he fixes that, I just wanted to remind you, so big announcement, everybody's heard about Helix today, right? Lots of news going on around Helix. So we have news about Helix as well. So as you've heard, Helix now is a convergence of both services and operations. And that means that we now have capacity optimization and cloud cost on the Helix platform. So you now have a choice of running those products on-prem or as a service. And the great news about running them as a service is you can see a lot of integration that you can really take advantage of on the Helix platform, offer you a lot more value, obviously with the SaaS product, easy to implement, easy to maintain. And so you're going to be hearing a lot more about that over time. So keep looking for that at the bmc.com website, and you'll be, and we'll be having some webinars coming up. So just stay in touch with that. And then hopefully they're going to get this fixed in a minute.
Thank you.
And I'm going to introduce Jason. Well, they are working with this, and hopefully they'll have it finished up. So Jason, as I said, works at Paychex, and he's been at Paychex for about 17 years now. And about 4 years ago, he took on a role to basically lead a capacity management management initiative there. And so Paychex decided that they really wanted to get more out of the resources that they had and do a better job of managing that investment. And so Jason took that initiative on, him and a small team of folks. They are using our capacity optimization product. And the whole goal was, number one, to get visibility into what they had, understand how they're using it, and then get a lot better at taking advantage of those resources without introducing risk, which is a really important thing. So it's always a balance between cost, efficiency, and risk. And so that's the initiative that him and his team took on. The other part that they added to that is they wanted to get really good at forecasting the future. So, what do they need to buy, and exactly when do they need to buy it? And the reason why it's so important to get all those things right is because ultimately what you really need to do, especially as a capacity planning team, is you have to start building trust in the organization. Because if you can't build trust in the organization, then nothing else matters, because nobody's going to pay attention to all of the great work you do. So that is one of the big challenges, and Jason was able to do that. And so I am going to turn it over to him and let him share his story, and with any luck, we'll have slides show up eventually. So.
Thank you, Robin. Guys, I am going to take this off because this is very weird to talk with these on and hear your echo. Robin kind of introduced us, so I don't know if I need to talk, right? You guys are all set? So at Paychex, I've been with Paychex for 17 years. I've worked in business units, I've worked in monitoring, I've worked in enterprise support, I've worked with project teams, I've worked with tech debt identification, service health reporting. For the last 4+ years now, I've been with Capacity. Capacity is a very new endeavor for me. I was asked to come in with the business knowledge that I had and try to bring our tools and our process to be future forecast and in line with our business needs. Hoping I'm going to have some slides here shortly. How are we doing, guys? We think we're good? Okay, I'm going to go through Robin's really quickly. Here's Robin's slides. So this is me, who I am. Like I said, 17+ years with Paychex. Very proud of being with Paychex for 17 years. I've enjoyed my time there. When I took over capacity planning, we really wanted to become that trusted partner. And that trusted partner is going to be something you're going to see across this whole slide deck. That became a huge portion of making sure that we were going to be sized appropriately and we were going to be able to utilize change and future changes to implement those recommendations we wanted to implement. So this is the evolution of Paychex capacity practice. What you're going to walk away with today is kind of how I took our team from a reactive approach and as we're moving into that proactive and predictive. How Paychex defined what capacity management is, which is that reactive and responsive phase, to capacity planning as it relates to that proactive and predictive phases. Just a quick agenda. We're going to go through introduction, some background, what our program maturity is, what some of those building blocks actually were, the benefits that we actually were able to get off of this, and then kind of what we're working on next. Just real quick, this is what's worked for us from a Paychex perspective. If you guys want to get professional services involved as a consultation, and that's absolutely up to you. Do not necessarily take this as any legal format that you guys can take and just automatically plug and play and that will work for you. Every circumstance needs to be taken in its own situation. Some background on Paychex. Paychex has been around for 48 years. We're quite proud of that. We are a human capital management services. We take care of HR, payroll, benefits, and insurance. Some of the footprint that we actually support, that I'm pretty proud of, is we have about 1.5 million HR workers that we actually are supporting. 12 million people that are being paid by our payroll product, both in the United States and in Europe. #1 record keeper as it relates to 401k. And we're the 20th largest insurance agent out of all of the United States. There's hundreds of agencies in there. Some of the awards that we're quite proud of winning. We're number 11th on the most ethical companies. We are very proud of that at Paychex. And from a technology perspective, we're very proud of being on in the world's most innovative companies. So what is our footprint at Paychex, and what does that look like? I'm going to walk you through where we were about 5 years ago, just before I came onto this team, to where we are going to today. 5 years ago, 2 data centers, no external cloud presence, about 10,000 servers, 83 mission-critical business technologies and applications that we were tracking through. My capacity team at that time was 4 people. We took care of 23 applications, which was only 27% of that total amount. And we covered only 2,500 production servers out of that 10,000. Today, we are in 3 data centers. We have a significant cloud presence in Azure. We have over 15,000 servers, 161 mission and business critical applications. My Paychex team, following Trung's example of doing more with less, I still have 4 people. We are out taking care of 72% of those mission critical and technical applications. It's 112 out of those. And we're up to 6,500 servers. I didn't do it. What'd I do? Oh, guess I. Gotcha. Sorry. Clicker problems. So when I came into the team, the capacity practice was not future focused at all. We weren't aligning with what our business needs were. Our charts looked like CPU against threshold. That was about all my team was actually doing. We were, like I said before, we were only doing it for about 23 of those applications. So one of the first things we said is, what are we trying to do with our capacity process? Where do we want to be? We wanted to be able to actually model and forecast the changes for that future. We wanted to understand what all the KPIs are, not just CPU, not just memory, not just I/O. We wanted to control cost as it relates to that and make sure that at everything we were doing, we were evaluating what the risk, cost, and recommendation actually was. So maturity. I always believe you can't go someplace your mind hasn't already been. I loved this quote. Anybody that has teenagers, raise your hand if you have teenagers. You all understand this quote quite well, right? We got to stop complaining. We got to start figuring out where we want to go next. And being able to define where you want to go helps you hit that maturity level. So that's what we did. We built what our capacity process maturity model actually is. Like I said before, we broke it into capacity management and capacity planning. We knew we wanted to be in that capacity planning phase, but we had to mark where we were at that time. And we were in those reactive and responsive states, understanding what the KPIs were, making sure that we could track them, making sure there was consistency around the way we were tracking them, understanding how much time we needed to baseline them and trend them to be able to actually understand and forecast where those were going. Getting into that proactive and predictive, now you're getting into what the business drivers are, where your peak time frames are, how do you correlate those types of situations to be able to really push forward and move to those next levels. You'll see this line in the middle. I love that curve. It's my favorite curve to show as an example. The biggest slope is between that responsive and proactive states. And that slope is very tight and very hard to get to from a responsive to a proactive state. You need a lot of information. You need a lot of business. You need a lot of technical information. And with 4 people, that's not always easy to do. So what were the actual building blocks for us to be able to build to that? The foundation of those blocks became best practices starting off. What are the KPIs that we actually care about? What is the time threshold we need to worry about? Are we looking at 5-minute averages? Are we looking at maxes? Are we looking at hourly, peak, 1-minute granularity? We had to look at all of that information and really consolidate that down. And we worked with our technology specialists to understand what that is, and we forced them to sign off on making sure that we were delivering the service that they were expecting. From there, we took it to tech stack. What are the applications that's using each technology? What are each of the servers or each individual piece of each of those technologies that we actually care about? Do they support it all overall, all the applications? Is it a shared technology? Understanding what the vendor's insight is, all of those situations around the technology. Those are then reviewed at the technology owner's level to be able to say, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're basing all of our information on, and what are you doing over the next 6 months to a year to make sure we understand your trend and resources. From there, it's app stacks. Taking those tech stacks, breaking those down based on those applications and saying, this is all of your application, all the different technologies that use it. What are the business drivers that now drive close to that we should be working on correlating? What are your peak time frames? What are the areas that you care about? And we forced our app owners to be a part of that process and take ownership in defining what those assumptions are that we should be basing that information off of. And lastly, it was scorecards. How do I leverage my senior leaders of our organization to help enforce the things that we're trying to actually do? And we've broken our scorecards down into 2 main line items. If I just look at your baseline for the last 18 months and project it out 6 months, do I have any concerns that baselines are changing on a frequent basis? That's just normal growth, hopefully, that you're catching. The other side of that is all the different efforts that are changing that baseline or could potentially change it in the next 6 months. We have to track those on an individual basis. We have to build models against those on an individual basis. We have to take into a certain amount of assumptions with those. And in order to do that, we tracked each one individually and rolled it up as a scorecard to our senior leaders so that they were aware of everything we were planning for. So how did we actually build it? It was meetings, meetings, meetings. And it still is. We had to work with our partners of architecture and solution leads. They knew what made up our applications. We needed to validate all of that information. They knew what the roadmaps were or of where things were going. They knew what the designs are of the things that were changing. In order to create value with that service partnership, we brought them baselines. We actually said, this is where you are today. This is where we think you're going in the next 6 months. If you're doing a project now that's going to change what we think is happening in the next 6 months, bring us in. How can we help forecast what those are and build right within your designs and your project efforts how much you need within that project effort? Collaboration with technology leads. This goes back to tech stacks and best practices. Give them ownership into providing you the technology needs that you need to have. As capacity analysts, we couldn't go out and research every possible technology, understand what the KPIs are that we needed to track, the level that we needed to track them, ensure that monitoring was then and taking care of those and then building those to that next level. We put that ownership on our tech leads. Regular meetings with application development managers. Meeting with our application development managers and giving ownership of capacity overall back into their hands. Allowing them to drive the level we go down to as it relates to workloads and business drivers. Same thing with technologies. We can't understand every application to the nth degree and every change that they're making. We need them to be part of it. We need them to be part of that discussion. We need them to help us evaluate the assumptions for every future effort and where we are to be able to track and predict where we're going. And then managing regularly on scorecards. Using these scorecards to leverage our senior leaders to putting the ownership back in all those different places to make sure that we can get the delivery that we need and the information we need to project and predict where capacity is actually going. All of these meetings happen on an every 2-week basis. So my 4 guys are meeting across all those applications, all those technologies, every 2 weeks. There's a certain amount every week, basically, that you're delivering on. Capacity doesn't change that often, but all of those other things do, right? And they're all working on all those different things. And knowing what those are all going on, you may not have the same discussion every 2 weeks. It could be very different. Sometimes you're going through a design for a brand new application. Sometimes you're just understanding how roadmaps are changing. Sometimes you're understanding how business drivers are changing or that there are new business drivers that are coming in. And what does that all look like? So what are the tools? We wanted to consolidate all of our KPIs into one tool. We took TrueSight as that tool. How do we bring all of the KPIs from a capacity perspective into that tool? How do we leverage our ETLs, leverage all of our monitoring information, and really make sure that we are using the modeling, forecasting, algorithms, and everything that needs to be manipulated around that data specific to that tool. Let BMC be the experts on how to do those things. We didn't want to have to be the experts on how to build all that. We wanted to leverage that. We basically wound up with 3 data sources as our main set of situations. It's our internal monitoring tool that kind of takes care of a broad group of other monitoring tools all built within one database so that we have one data source. App Dynamics and Splunk. We use other tools, right? Everybody's going to use other tools. Those don't necessarily think that, we're trying to leverage TrueSight for the majority of the data specific to all of everything from a capacity perspective. So what was kind of realized as it relates to all of this? How did we get to, or where did we get to? How was it actually interpreted? Again, I love this quote. Nothing gets transformed in your life until your mind is transformed. So in the beginning, we had 13 different data sources. I had one guy looking at only storage across my whole organization. Capacity incidents, we were having about 20 on a given year, or of what we call a major incident. A major incident to us at Paychex is 100 clients are impacted. Doesn't matter the time frame. If it's 1 minute, 100 clients are impacted, we actually will deem it as a major incident. Ad hoc requests. This was taking a huge amount of time. These were giant efforts. We're going after migrating clients from one application to another. What does that look like? How do we actually do it? That was the only type of work we were looking at. We weren't looking at every individual project. The recommendations my team was coming up with were all functional work items as it relates to the teams that needed to implement that work. It was ad hoc, it was on demand, we need to do it right away, how do we stop what we're doing and get that work in to make sure that we were not going to have a future capacity incident. And we were limited to scope. 23 applications, 50% of my team's time was literally saying, this is the threshold, this is where you currently are based on that threshold from a capacity perspective. They weren't future planning in any way, shape, or form. Today's benefit. We became a trusted partner within DevOps. We had a seat at the table. People would bring us data. They were asking us to be involved with the conversations on the things that they were changing. My team is currently tracking 140 ongoing projects and efforts that are going to change between now and the next 6 months. 77 of our recommendations were made this year. We didn't cause any outages. They were planned. They were put as part of a project effort or planned efforts that never caused any issues, implemented well before any issues would ever happen. Reduction of major incidents. In the last 2 years, we've had less than one a year. Right? Huge difference. We became totally forward-focused. All of my scorecard is looking at that next 6 months. We're using our baselines to predict the next 6 months. Nothing's going to affect us now. We're always forward-focused. We've increased scope. We've taken on brand new technologies within Paychex and even specifically within the capacity team. And we're looking at Solar, OpenShift, Kafka, Azure, where we are from a cloud perspective. We are tracking all of the costs across Azure, and we are managing all of that. In the last 3 years, we've been less than 5% over budget. Everything we've been over budget as it relates to Azure has been specific to brand new items that were brought in after the planned year and forecast was taken care of. Tracking 300 critical transactions across our applications. And we're using those critical transactions to correlate back within the application to understand what the capacity growth is actually going to be. So maturity scoring. I wanted to measure maturity. So I forced my team to give every maturity level a percentage. Our goal state right now is to get to proactive. We're close. Not quite where I want to be, but we're close. That's our goal state right now. We track 322 different component groupings. Component grouping is a like technology performing a specific function within an application or technology. Right? Could be a group of servers, a group of databases, or something along those lines. 320. Some of those are used in multiple different ones, but those are 322 unique component groups. 112 total app and tech stacks that we are reviewing with application owners and technology owners that the 322 component groups work into. That's 72% of all of the mission critical stacks that we currently have that we want to actually be covering. Trying to get to 100% on that as we onboard new stuff. With an overall maturity of 75% today. So what's next? Future depends on what we do today. So we're already trying to get there, right? That's really what this quote is supposed to mean, is that you got to start building those blocks for your future today. Every day you got to be looking at the next 5 steps. So that's really what we're at. What are our next 5 steps? Service views. We are partnering hand in hand with BMC right now on where they're going with service views within TSCO. Service views are going to be our next view of dashboards and scorecards back to our tech owners and our app owners for them to be able to see what their days to saturation look like and how they're going to understand where their growth is from a capacity perspective. Models. How do I leverage modeling and correlation to drive out limits to our business units? Instead of a business unit coming to me and saying, Jason, I need you to tell me if I'm going to be in a problem if I'm going to run 15,000 transactions or I up my client counts to X amount. I can tell you today on a transaction that actually has good correlation what your limit is. I could tell you exactly where you're going to break. Why don't I provide that to them now and say, you don't have to worry about that. I'll watch just to let you know if that changes. Until then, we're good. Keep working. Keep selling. Costs. How do I build cost into every recommendation I have? CPU means nothing to a business unit. Memory means nothing. Database connections mean nothing. They want to know how much it's going to cost to equate to it. Otherwise, they're going to say, go do it from an IT perspective of go add the connections, go add the servers, go do what you got to do. We have to build every recommendation to having a cost and understand what the risk is if you don't either execute that cost or execute that recommendation. And give them that decision-making process to be able to say, should we execute on that cost? Should we execute on those risks? And what do we need to do? And related back to risks, are we sized correctly? Are we oversized? Are we undersized? Where is the right boundaries of being sized correctly actually fall? Where are you with automation? In cloud infrastructure, you can auto scale. You should be using a good portion of your infrastructure. You shouldn't have waste out there. You can scale it up and down and use different things to cut costs as well as scale. How do we do that in our own data centers as well? And continuously onboarding. How do I get to that 100% and on our mission critical and business critical applications? How do I make sure that I'm covering all of those technologies? Is how do we keep up to speed on all of those things at all times? Those are really our next steps of focuses. And we are in bits and pieces on every one of those things right now. I have a POC on service views right now that we are actually going out to our service directors. BMC is actually going to be meeting with us and the service directors to say, how would you guys use this? What are other things you guys want to do? And trying to define some of those next set of requirements. Those models I'm leveraging today, I've built limits on some of those critical transactions, all for our peak timeframes, so that we can actually test them and validate if they're accurate or not. Costs, we're starting to do that with all of our recommendations today. Sizing correctly, we are starting to challenge our DR and HA thresholds to say, are they too strict in some cases? And like I said before, we are continuously onboarding. So we are getting to those today and doing bits and pieces of them. How do we do them better? Like I said before, the foundation blocks really come into these plays. What are the best practices? How do you get your technology owners to take some accountability? What are your app stacks? And making sure that you understand what that application actually is. And how do you deliver a scorecard to help your senior leaders make decisions? Key takeaways again, how we're going from reactive the predictive and what the difference between capacity management and capacity planning really are. Do you want to be a capacity manager or a capacity planner? And that's really where you got to focus your time. Any questions or comments? I probably need my headset, so sorry.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions? A terrific story. So.
Hi, I have a quick question. Among all the analysis that you did, what are the key KPIs that you found it most useful and then you track for your capacity planning?
Oh, that's a huge count. It all depends on different technologies. And that's really what we've focused on, is working with the SMEs on each technology to actually say that. I mean, there's a subset of standard capacity measures like CPU and memory that I do across almost everything. But then every technology, I mean, there's specific directories that I look at for Oracle databases. There's database connections I look across everything. I look at threads as it relates to web logic connections. And they're all over the board. Every technology has its own, and there's probably 5 to 6 that we are probably measuring across multiple technologies.
Thanks. Hey, Jason, that's great. How did you get the application teams and tech stack owners to first meet with you to start giving you the information that you needed?
With lots and lots of questions, right? We were peppering them with emails. We were peppering them with lots of different situations. And so we decided to pull them into meetings and try to say, this is what we're trying to do. This is why we're trying to do it. We're trying to get to this level of maturity. Help us understand more of what these applications actually are. As we started getting into more and more conversations, it became less about questions and more of us providing that service to them. And it became more about help us identify those assumptions that we are not going to be able to answer. Help me provide that service that I'm trying to for you.
So I have a question based on that. What kind of a shift have you seen in the attitude of your dev teams now that they've worked with you for a while? You know, you going to them and trying to pull information. So have the dynamics changed now?
They pull us in. It's not as much as we need to actually reach out as often. They are looking for certain pieces of detail. Well, what are the assumptions that you've used for that model? Well, they don't need to see where the resources are. Very rarely am I ever bringing a chart in front of them now. Most of the time I'm saying, these are the things that I've assumed. Based on that, I feel all of your best practices are going to be okay, or I think you need to make a recommendation here. And it really comes down to, I'm just telling you what I think you either need to do or that you're okay. It's not about, here's what the chart's showing and how your baseline's bouncing up and down. They trust that we look at that. They don't look at any of the detail. I don't give them access to the TSCO reports. They don't need to necessarily see them. If there's something specific that I want to show or they're digging deeper into something, we'll pull that in as a special topic.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Okay, wait, we have another one.
Jason, great presentation. I have one question. In your capacity planning, do you have any funding issue that you're planning a lot, but you don't get the funding? What's the challenge?
Funding specific, help me understand where you're going with that. Funding specific to the capacity process in itself, funding to the recommendations where you.
Say for example, you're predicting, right?
Yep.
You're predicting this capacity that I need, but they said, I'm not giving any funding. So what should you do?
So it's an easy thing for me, right? I'm providing like a consultation type of a service. I can bring it to a dev owner, I can bring it to a business unit and say, this is what the cost actually is going to be, this is what your risk is, this is what your recommendation is I can let that completely be at a senior leader level to make the decision of whether or not they want to accept that risk or whether or not they want to actually take on that project effort and cost. I think that's where the costs really play in understanding what it is and allowing a business unit to kind of be forced to say, this is what I'm going to save off of that, which is why I think I want to do it, and kind of start building that show back type of a model as it relates to those recommendations. So I don't really have issues with that. In most cases, nobody wants to take on risk. They're always scared of risk, right? They don't want major incidents. They don't want outages. So a lot of the cases is we go out and purchase it. But you're right, we got to do more with less, which is why we're at least presenting the use case of what is those risks and do you want to take those on?
Did you calculate savings on, avoiding hardware purchases or, optimizing your resources? Is that one of the things that you track?
So we've taken cost on at a very low level, or I should say very specific level within our cloud environment today with Azure. So we do a lot of that in the Azure environment because that is a straight OpEx cost and everybody sees it and nobody likes the budget when we actually show them the budget of that. And so we've had to stay very close to that. We're expanding that scope to get into a lot more of that within our on-prem resources and understand what the cost-benefit analysis of that is. That is where we talk about being sized correctly, right? How can I ensure that we're not buying hardware we don't need? And how do we make sure that we're sized at the right level against the risk level that we want to be at? So that's the spots we're getting to right now with being able to make those recommendations and understand the risk against the cost.
Any other questions? We still have a little bit of time. Okay. Oh.
So, Jason, one question. Good presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
I do have a question around cloud, right, and capacity management and proactively, right? You already talked about scalability, and it already manages itself pretty much.
Yep.
So what's your take on doing the capacity planning, not the management, planning around the cloud resources?
So with cloud resources, the only way you can actually do capacity planning is having a great test cases. Right? You need to understand what drives your workload at each of the different levels and components that you're actually using, and you have to be able to test for it in each of those levels. We work very close with our dev teams. We scale up our test environment each time specifically based on the test cases that we actually have, and we work very closely with them to try to model out exactly what they think they're going to use and then validate that against our models.
Okay, and as far as sizing correctly, how do you go about sizing that?
So some of it is a little bit of a guesswork, and then some of it is trial and error within your test cases. There's really no way to do it. It's no different than if you're actually switching sometimes from one technology to another. I can tell you what your baseline currently is and how you're going to, and what's being used, but until you put it into that new baseline and try to understand what a specific workload against that is, and you have to measure it at the workload level, right? You're really trying to get to that correlation of these drivers correlate to these or these KPI or capacity metrics. And because they correlate, I know this amount is going to add this much. If you can't get to that, you're not going to, it's going to be a guesswork.
Cool. Thank you.
How you doing, Jason?
Good.
So, how are you using BMC to present the KPIs? Are you using BMC to provide that, I guess, any transparency, for example?
Nope. So almost all of those documents that we talked about, best practices, tech stacks, app stacks, those are written documentations that we actually store. They are then manually loaded into TSCO, all within my own team. All of those KPIs are done within my own team. TSCO is only used within my team. My team is the one that's leveraging it. I want to make sure that I have confidence in my capacity practice across all of those resources. And then when we get into the service views, that we've built that level of confidence, I can then go out and display those dashboards and those KPIs and those service views and be able to show them. What I did not want to happen by sending TSCO out to multiple partners is for them to find one thing that's missing and go, do I trust this tool anymore? Right? That's the biggest fear I have with every tool. Well, because once somebody loses confidence, It's very hard to get back.
Any other questions? We have a few more minutes. No? Okay, well, thank you very much, and particularly
you,
to
everyone.
Jason for such a wonderful presentation. And he will be around if you have any questions, catch him at the networking event. Okay? So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, guys.